Good morning, everybody. Go ahead and go on to the next section. We're on 28.2 today. Homeostasis is the first thing in this chapter section, and it refers to the body's ability to maintain relatively stable internal conditions, even though the outside world is constantly changing. So your body has to have set amounts of electrolytes, water, and temperature, among other things, to work properly. And if they're outside that range, your body will start to shut down and stop working. For example, 98.6 is the average body temperature. But if you get to about 80 degrees, your body will go into a coma and shut down because the chemical reactions in your body will be slower and slower with a lower temperature until they eventually stop. And then with a high temperature, about 106 to 108 or above, it's fatal because the proteins that make up your body just change shape. And when they change shape, they don't work anymore. And so your body has to have a set condition, set amount of temperature, water, electrolytes, etc., for it to work properly. And homeostasis is the body maintaining those right levels. And you can see on here in this picture, there's a few things that are maintained. Oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide coming out. Urinary system refers to how much water enters and leaves the cells. Your blood system. Digestive, takes up waste and then gives the body nutrients, salt, and water. So it doesn't always mean that they're always the same inside your body. Conditions can vary slightly, but they only vary within a certain very narrow window. So throughout the day, you might have a 1 degree difference in body temperature. You might go from 97 degrees in the morning to 98 degrees in the afternoon. But it still is a very small difference and not a large difference in temperature. So if a human or an animal or a plant has to survive, the conditions inside those cells of the animal, human, or plant has to be stable. For any living being, if they're outside a certain set number of conditions, then that cell will break down or the body will break down. So internal conditions refer to things within the body or within the cell. And then external conditions would be the environment around the body or the cells. So internal environment would include the cells and the things inside the cells, but also the fluid around the cells, the blood that goes over the cells, body temperature within the body. These would all be internal environment conditions. So with the exception of the cells on your skin, all your body cells are surrounded by a body fluid. It's mostly water, but it's a plasma. It contains some protein, some salts, and all the cells are washed over this body fluid. And if they don't have enough salts or water, the cells will change size, change their function, and they might shut down. And then the blood system carries nutrients to the cells along with oxygen, and then it takes away waste products along with carbon dioxide. And that helps maintain the right conditions of the cells by taking away waste and giving the cells nutrients and oxygen. So I mentioned this earlier, but go to write this down. At about the 106 degrees, the enzymes in your body start to just break down. Enzymes are made of proteins, and proteins only work within a certain temperature range. And if they're outside the temperature range, then they change shape and then they can't work. Because proteins work like a key in a lock, and they have to fit the lock exactly. And if they change shape, they can't do that and they can't work. And then below 80 degrees, basically you fall into a sleep. Your heart stops, your brain shuts down. And so things just slow down in your body as it gets colder and colder. Calcium content is very important in your body too. Calcium is used for moving your muscles. And if it's too high, you'll go into a coma and the cells just can't work properly. And if it's too low, your heart will beat irregularly because your heart is a muscle and calcium is important for muscle movement. Okay, so for the body to maintain the right conditions, communication is essential for this to work. Actually, let's go back to this one later. I don't think this one should be here. Um, let's let's just start with this one. We'll go back to that one later on. So in order to maintain homeostasis, you need a sensor, also called a receptor. A receptor gathers information outside and inside the body and shares that with the brain. So these would be things, usually the nerve cells, but they would be monitoring the temperature of the body inside and out. They'd be monitoring salt levels, water levels, oxygen levels, sugar levels. And they each have their own job to do, but they monitor the conditions of the body and then tell the brain if those conditions are good or if they're outside the range they should be in. The control center, usually it's the brain, receives information from the sensors. So some sensors in your body are going to monitor heat and temperature. Some monitor just a hot temperature, and they'll tell the body when it's too hot. Others monitor cold, and they'll tell the body only when it's too cold. Others monitor pain or pressure. Others monitor water levels. So each has their own job, and they only monitor one thing at a time. And these are nerves that tell the brain the conditions and if they're changing. So you can see in here in this chart, so there's a stimulus which would affect the sensor. It could be hot temperature, for example. And that stimulus then makes the sensor send a message to the brain, the control center. And so we're at this point right here. So you can see on here, a stimulus could be body temperatures above 37 degrees Celsius, which is 98 degrees. And if it is above that temperature, sensors like nerve cells with endings in the skin and brain will send a message to the brain, to the hypothalamus, telling the brain it's too hot. Then at that point, the brain will respond to that message and tell the sweat glands to start sweating to cool the body down. So the control center compares information that it gets from the sensors with the set point. The body has a certain set point that it should be in. 98.6 is the body's set point for temperature. There's other conditions for salts, sugar levels, water levels. And if they're outside that range, then the brain will send a signal to the communication system to change those conditions back to normal. And as those conditions change, the body will respond. As you sweat, you'll cool down, but eventually you need to stop sweating or it'll get too cold. And so the sensors will tell the body when it's getting close to the right temperature to start to stop sweating. Does everybody have this one down? The communication system is made of the nervous and endocrine systems, and they carry information throughout the body. The nervous system includes the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves that come off the brain and spinal cord. Endocrine system, many organs that make hormones. So we have things like the thyroid gland, the pancreas, adrenal glands, pituitary, hypothalamus. I think I mentioned these yesterday, but the pineal gland secretes melatonin to tell you to go to sleep. The hypothalamus is the body's thermostat, and so it decides the right temperature to be at. If it's too hot or too cold, it will cool the body down or warm it up. Now, when you have a fever, the thermostat gets higher. So if the body thinks that it's infected or knows it's infected, then it will set its temperature to be about 101, 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will allow the body to fight the virus off better by having a higher thermostat reading. So sometimes your body intentionally makes the temperature hotter, but normally it's about 98 degrees or so. The last one on here, the effector, also called the target, that's any organ or cell that changes its activity in response to a message. So in this diagram, it's the sweat glands. Those are the targets. If you're too cold, the target will be your muscles shivering and warming back up. So some targets, you can see on here, a sweat gland would be a target. If you're too hot, it will be activated. Another target, if you're too cold, would be the erector pili muscle right here. It's a very small muscle attached to your hair follicle. So in every hair, you have a tiny muscle that will be activated if you're too cold. And it will pull this hair up. And if you don't have a hair right there, you'll have a goosebump. Now, for us, they don't really do a whole lot, but for other animals that have a lot of hair, they're more useful. So for animals that have a lot of hair on them, this is really important because it provides this layer of insulation. You have this pocket of air that the hair keeps close to their body, and they feel a lot warmer when that happens. Another thing that helps the animal is that it makes them look bigger. So if they're in danger, they might puff up. They might get goosebumps when they're scared because their hair if it's raised, makes them look a lot bigger than normal, and that can help them fight off a predator. So that's why we might get goosebumps too when we're frightened. And it doesn't really help us because we don't have a lot of hair, but for animals that have a lot of hair, it is very useful to have their hair stand up. Okay, so just to review, you don't need to write this down because you already did, but this is to review what we just talked about. So there's 4 elements of a control system. You have sensors that gather data. You have a control center that receives the data and sends messages throughout the body to respond to those messages. Communication system, like a nervous system, endocrine system, delivers a message to the targets, and the targets respond to the change. So again, that's just to overview what we just talked about. You don't have to write this down, you can, but we already went through all of these. It's just a review of what we just talked about. Okay, so there's 2 kinds of feedback we'll talk about now. There's negative and positive feedback. Let's not do this one. Let's go into this one. We'll go back to that one in a second. But in general, feedback is information from sensors that allows a control center to compare current conditions to set values. So what that means is that, again, if you get too hot, there's a sensor that tells your body you're too hot. And then the body will then respond to that change. That's what feedback means. When the body gets a message telling it about the conditions and then changing those conditions if needed. So the body has to decide upon set values and decide what those values are, the right body temperature, the right amount of salt and water. And once it decides those values, it will then monitor them to keep them in line. But the body has to have those values in place for it to work. Babies who are born premature don't always have the hypothalamus formed properly. And without the hypothalamus formed, they don't have a thermostat. So the body hasn't decided the right temperature to be at. And so the babies who are born prematurely need to be wrapped in a lot of blankets and kept warm because the body doesn't know to keep it at the right temperature. But as they get older, the brain develops and then decides the right body temperature to be at 98 degrees, and it keeps it at that temperature. Okay, so I mentioned negative feedback earlier. Its job is to bring conditions back to the right set point. And then as it brings it back to normal, the response shuts down. And the best example of negative feedback would be a thermostat. If you have a too high temperature, the thermostat will then send out cool air. So it's too hot, so it sends out the opposite. It sends out cool air to counteract the hot air. But as it cools down to the right temperature, the cold air will shut off because he doesn't want to get below a certain temperature. So you had 68 degrees. You don't want it to get below or above that temperature. So you don't want it to be too cold. So the cold air will shut off to prevent that from happening. Okay, so the examples in your body would include things like heart rate. So the body will monitor your heart rate and make sure it doesn't get too high or too low. Blood pressure, the same thing. You want the right blood pressure. And if it's too high, the veins will start to open up to reduce the pressure. If it's too low, the veins will start to close to make the pressure higher. Breathing rate, again, the same thing. If you're breathing too fast, it will try to calm that down and slow down your breathing. So most everything in the body that's controlled through feedback is negative feedback. There are a few things that are not controlled though by negative feedback, which we'll get to in a second. Let's not worry about that. Okay, so positive feedback would be the other response, and that's opposite of negative feedback. So while negative feedback moves conditions back to their set point, back to where they should be, positive feedback moves them away from their normal state, even further from where they should be. An example of positive feedback would be blood clotting. So when you have an injury, chemicals are secreted that stimulate clotting. And the more chemicals you have in that area, the more clotting is going to happen. So this sends out a chain reaction where with more chemicals, you get more clotting, you get more chemicals, and this builds on itself. Another example would be uterine contractions. So when a baby is being delivered, the muscles around the baby in the womb are going to push the baby out. And with every push, they get more intense and more frequent. So with every contraction, there's a message being sent to the brain to make another contraction that is faster and stronger than the one before that. Another example would be milk being produced while breastfeeding. So as a baby nurses, more milk is being produced. So the message being sent to the brain is to make more milk as the baby nurses. So these are all positive feedback mechanisms where with each one of these things being done, it makes the body do more of that thing. And you can see on here, this is what a blood clot looks like. So when you have a scab, that's a blood clot. That's what you're seeing inside the scab. And so you have these pink fibers, kind of like silly string, that are very sticky, and they make the blood cells stick in place. These are the red blood cells that would be flowing out if they weren't stuck here. Then you have the platelets, and these platelets help keep the fibers in place and help secrete the fibers of the blood clot. A white blood cell is trapped here too. So these have very special and short-lived functions. So they're only meant to last for a certain amount of time. Usually they're very fast and then they stop. Another picture of blood clotting. So you can see a damaged blood vessel right here. And then the blood would come out of the vessel, but with this blood clot, it plugs the hole and the blood stays inside the blood vessel. Okay, that's it for today as far as the notes go. For homework today, it's on page 807. Do questions 1 through 5. And then tomorrow we'll do 28.3.
Miss Holly, for number 5, is it just that mammals can sort of, they don't need to go anywhere to survive better in their environment? Like they can still stay in the same place and their body just changes?
Yeah, exactly. So mammals can go all over in different environments. They can be in cold or hot climates, and but reptiles have a harder time being, especially in cold climates, but also in really hot climates. So that's exactly right.